All right, so in addition to the environmental harms that most people are familiar with, pollution, toxification, denuding of the resources available to us, especially those that are non-renewable, capitalism also impoverishes disenfranchised and marginalized communities with greater frequency than it does their white, middle, and upper class counterparts. And when I say to you that these are like forecasting future talks, we have a talk set aside to talk about race in the environment, and so this idea will be teased out more then, but again, we can talk about it in the Q&A. Perhaps the best example of this that you're most familiar with is the ongoing struggle over the Dakota Access Pipeline, which shifted its original route near Bismarck to Cannonball, North Dakota. And though it seems in the media that laying the pipeline through Native American controlled land is a rather egregious anomaly in the status quo, that's in fact not the case. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, although I imagine that this group of people probably is. But the pipeline was originally planned to run about 12 miles behind Bismarck, and the neighborhood closest to it was a white, elite, very wealthy suburb. And they were like, no, that's not good because pipeline's leaking, they'll destroy our community. And so they rerouted it through Cannonball on the presumption that the Native American community didn't have enough social capital or political capital to combat the pipeline. And then we have a 24-hour news cycle with water cannons and rubber bullets, right? But you didn't see that in the white neighborhood. All they had to do was say, no, please don't. That's dirty and we don't want it. And then it moved, right? Okay. So environmental hazards disproportionately affect minority communities. And given the severity of the problems, it's difficult to argue that it's unintentional. And there are a number of people that we can talk about, researchers and philosophers and other theorists who make these arguments. And again, we'll talk about them in a couple of weeks when we have that talk. It is the exploitation of nature and the ways in which both community and natural environments are exploited that make capitalist endeavors not only destructive but unsustainable. This unsustainability is disproportionately present in communities that are already suffering the ill effects of capitalistically structured race, class, and gender relationships. Hence, these communities, rife with struggles against capitalism and already aware of the need for a justice-oriented environmentalism, are perfectly situated to develop a neo-Marxist green revolution. Many of these communities, from the rural areas of Appalachia and the western states to the inner cities of American metropolises, are targeted by capitalists precisely because they tend to lack the necessary socio-political capital to thwart a capitalist venture. And they are highly dependent on capitalism as a system for their survival, right? Most of these people get their sustenance from places like Walmart, Cobb's, Kroger, King Soopers, what have you. They're also heavily dependent for resources like water on the delivery systems that are in place in the infrastructure until those fail, and then you get Flint, and we don't talk about Flint, right? Okay, so here's the problem then that I think Marx kind of gets right, and then kind of drops the ball. Right? So the relationship of these people to capitalism is easily summed up as survival by self-destruction. Right? I think that's right. Marx rightly points out that the logic of capitalism is self-defeating, and it makes sense for the people most at risk to utilize Marx's tools for their escape from capitalist expectations. So part of what I would say community gardens do in terms of subversion is they give us as activists a narrative structure to employ that has nothing to do with reliance on capitalism, right? It doesn't use the same narrative signposts, it doesn't use the same systems of support, and it offers people an opportunity to reconnect with communities in a way that capitalism abhors, right? Capitalism is about competition, not cooperation. So when you're acting cooperatively, you're acting in an anti-capitalist way. Capitalists know that, and so they try to keep these societies, these communities fragmented. Okay, and that's part of what I think community gardening can help us overcome. Okay, so let's talk about then how a green Marxist resistance may or may not look, thanks to Marx. So using Marxist philosophy as an approach to eco-resistance ought to strike the in-the-know Marxist as a difficult prospect. And though I make that assumption on your behalf, I'm also assuming secretly that you know nothing about Marx. So I'm happy to fill in the gaps when we get to the Q&A. Right. Marx was not terribly keen on the environment as much as, other than the location of raw materials, going so far in the German ideology to remark upon the idiocy of rural life. Okay. And you'll kind of pick this up in Marx at times when he talks something when he says the idiocy of rural life, he means something like living with loincloths and spears and wiping your butt with pine cones, right? Like, that's crazy talk. Nobody wants to trade their toilet paper for pine cones. I mean, just straw poll. I never get those people. They never show up at any event that I do, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Because you like toilet paper. And so Marx is going to argue that this idea that there's some primitive existence that's preferable is counterintuitive to what it means to live communally, right? At one point, that was the best we could do. We can do better now, and we should. That's going to be Marx's pitch, right? So when he looks at the environment as a rural endeavor, he sees it as the location of raw materials, right? Timber for building, stone for building, dirt for growing, right? And so that tends to be how he treats it, both in his early writings and middle writings. But in the same work, The German Ideology, Marx will argue that alienation can only be abolished when it becomes an intolerable power, capable on the one hand, when it has rendered the great mass of humanity propertyless, his word, not mine, and on the other hand, produced the contradiction of an existing world of wealth and culture. What renders the masses propertyless is not just the private ownership of the land by industry, but also the usurpation of the individual's access to land and rights of use. So it's not enough that corporations kind of colonize places and like fence us out of them, but then they regulate through political lobbying and control of politicians what you can do, right? So when you can hunt, where you can hunt, when you can cut a tree down, why you can cut a tree down. Sometimes they'll cut your tree down for you if it gets too close to their power lines, that kind of thing. And so this would be industry determining how you're going to exist in the world, okay? And that's a form of alienation, and one that is talked about separately from the other forms of alienation Marx works with. So it's an important point for this conversation especially. Capitalism must control how land and resources are used, even when industry does not own them, in order to ensure the greatest amount of productivity of and profit from the raw materials at society's disposal. This is best illustrated by recent laws that prohibit the collection of rainwater in Florida, the creation of sterile seeds that create perpetual customers out of farmers, right? Monsanto's really good at this. And also, if you're staying on top of stuff, right, Colorado outlawed camping on your own property for more than 3 days in a row to ensure that people couldn't collectively buy land and camp on it, which a lot of people were doing, and then their property taxes were really low because they didn't have structures. And so the state government came in and said you can't do that anymore. Idaho followed suit shortly after, so there are at least 2 states where you can't camp on a 4-day weekend on your own property. That should strike you as odd. If it doesn't, we really need to talk. Right? Marx, of course, does not really include agriculture in his larger sustained critiques of capitalism as forms of existence, except to indicate that it represents an outmoded form of production. For Marx, the separation of town and country is the greatest division of material and mental labor, and the abolition of the antagonism between town and country is the first condition of communal life. That's Marx, right? So he's got this weird kind of this weird way of ignoring the environment, but then simultaneously saying it's really important that you reconcile city life with natural life, or you can't have communal life. As Bill Martin rightly points out, this ignores the question of where the food for the revolution is going to come from. Right? So Marx has this problem. In this omission by Marx to fully integrate a sense of the rural and the urban, the current contradiction of life under capitalism is felt most strongly. Food production is a capitalist-controlled industry, so if you want to eat, you have to work. As more and more land is owned by fewer and fewer corporations that also have the ability to dictate the uses of those resources, it's increasingly hard to separate yourself from the capitalist infrastructure because it's hard to provide for yourself on I don't know how big your front yard is, right? But most places won't let you grow food in your front yard either. That's usually against the law because we have this fetishism for green grass lawns that stems from Victorian ideas of like neighborhood beauty. And so most places you can only grow food in your backyard, and most of you probably don't have a backyard big enough to feed yourself for a year. And so that's a problem, right? Never mind that there aren't really nuts and berries around for like communal gathering, okay? So that's a problem, and capitalists know it, and so long as they can continue that process and keep that relationship in place, you're kind of stuck. Marx's urban ideology is so influential that it is not uncommon for social and political thinkers to ignore the question of agriculture But it seems obvious now that any resistance to capitalism must integrate the urban and the rural in order to both refashion a harmonious human existence with nature and overcome the cyclical nature of self-defeating dependence that capitalism produces. This may seem a little pedestrian as far as conclusions go, but the thrust of the argument here is not that this is something new under the sun, so to speak. It is that the reintegration of the rural and urban cannot merely be a consciousness about the importance of the one for the other, as if these are two distinct things, but rather we have to learn to start thinking of nature as the place where we live in a variety of settings that spans a spectrum from the country holler to the concrete and glass epicenter of urbanity. This cannot happen so long as those in the city are dependent upon those in the country, because that dichotomous existence is at the heart of alienation. And you see this play out over and over again in the antagonism between urbanites and city dwellers and their rural counterparts, where we have developed a whole language of disparaging one another and employ it regularly to lampoon one another and maintain a political distance, right? That's why we have so many polarizing conversations and not nearly enough progressivism.